Welcome to the final TELedvisors webinar for the year. Today we're looking at reflective learning with ePortfolios, and we have three amazing presenters with us today who were also at the ePortfolios Australia Forum back in September. I'll hand over now to our MC, Chia Adachi.
So the next presenter, the last presenter we have is Kate Coleman from Melbourne Uni. She's an artist, researcher and teacher based in Melbourne. She's the Australasian representative on the board of directors of Association of Authentic, Experiential and Evidence-Based Learning and World Council representative for the Southeast Asia Pacific region for the International Society for Education Through Art. Her work focuses on the integration of digital pedagogies and digital portfolios for sustained creative practice and assessment. Her PhD was the first fully online thesis as digital portfolio submitted at the University of Melbourne, where she now is a lecturer in visual arts and design, teaches secondary education at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Over to you, Kate.
Hi. Very nice panel to be invited into. Thank you so much, Heather and Emma. I probably am one of the painful people that locate myself theoretically in portfolios all the time. So if I speak too much edu-speak or a bit of theoretical conceptual stuff, then pull me up on it and send me some downer faces in the chat, because I think that it's very lovely to talk about nice examples of what portfolios look like, but we too often neglect the concept of them as educational spaces and the reason for them. So I'm going to kind of take us there. It's heavy for lunch, I know, but it's one of the most important bits about portfolios that I think is so important. And hopefully I can tie some threads between what Emma and Heather have also discussed in relationship to reflective learning. So I've got there then in my title with, in, through and as, and I think that one of the most important bits of portfolios that often also get neglected when we do our learning design around what evidence might look like. But what reflective learning in a portfolio looks like, or with a portfolio, or through a portfolio, and as a portfolio is the bit that I'm really interested in as a researcher. And one of the things that I made as my focus for my PhD research that would impact on what practice-led research look like, hopefully in integrative and transformative learning, and then how portfolios might actually support that kind of transformation of knowledge, particularly in higher education. But my research focuses on the implications for secondary school, because I think that that's actually where this type of learning needs to begin. So that the standardized education framework that we're currently seeing in many secondary schools shifts. So my ePortfolio journey begins back with Dave Bowd and Assessment 2020, because it really was, for me, the kind of steps, or what Dave called propositions, into what reform in higher education might look like. And ePortfolio solved every one of those propositions for me. I was working in what we called reflective blogs with students, where students out on their internships were actually using blog spaces to talk about what they were doing while they were out on their internships and create digital, well, at the time, e-learning, but now what I can refer to as digital communities of practice. So the biggest part of that inside the with, in, through and as are the threshold concepts involved, not just in ePortfolio, but in reflection. So reflexive learning and reflexive teaching and reflexive writing and reflexive thinking are the first part of that threshold concept before we actually enter into a space of reflection. Because reflective learning is actually very difficult to do when it's being asked of you, and you, like creativity, have to somehow turn it on when someone asks, and then quickly turn it off and enter into another space. And creative practitioners talk about flow, and that kind of flow is actually required in moments of reflection, where you actually need time to look back, to look forward, and to think about different types of futures. And how you actually do that needs to be scaffolded and modelled, and not taught, but practiced. And so an ePortfolio as practice research is actually what I think we need to talk about in higher education. And going back to Dave's propositions and using that type of sustainable assessment is the language in thinking about ePortfolio as a threshold concept, but then what the transformative knowledge within that is, what the irreversible concepts inside those threshold concepts might be, and how it is that a learner is unlikely to forget what it means to be reflexive and to do reflection, to ultimately develop reflective practice. Because it's in that metacognitive appraisal of how you think and why you think and how you know that you know it, that's actually what we now know from over 20 years of research in ePortfolios. And within that is that integrative learning. So the Association of American Colleges and Universities have a really wonderful rubric for ePortfolios that they call the integrative learning rubric. And within threshold concepts, it's an important part of exposing the interrelationships and interrelatedness of concepts. So how does a student within their program actually start to connect the dots, to pull things together about what it is that they've learnt in this unit, in that unit, and another unit, and how that's impacting on the kinds of things that are also going on in their lives. So it's irreversible because they're unlikely to forget it, because new ways of thinking are being recognised. There's a pattern within that you can actually start to see. So we teach writing, and we teach literacy and numeracies and some visual literacies in terms of patterns. And we get used to those patterns, seeing those patterns, hearing those patterns, and then talk about that kind of muscle memory, I guess, if I use my arts language. And they are irreversible bits of knowledge, where I actually can go into that space and I don't have to work my way back into it. And I think it's a really important part of reflection. And so within that threshold concept is this bound knowledge, you know, where the other thresholds or new conceptual spaces actually begin to form new conceptual understandings of what it is that you're learning about. So if I locate that in terms of someone actually being able to see and understand the way they acquire knowledge, we know that portfolios actually do that. We now know that because the Association of American Colleges and Universities have now listed ePortfolios as the 11th high impact practice. And that means that this kind of experience, this kind of inquiry, and if I locate, you know, that all in educational speak, that a student is actually in charge of the site that they are designing. And what they are designing in that, they're bringing as a conceptual site all of the knowledges that they're learning in all of the different areas of their lives, so that it's integrative, because it's personal and it's relevant. It's about the degree that they're actually working within. And they're starting to use the portfolio as reflection to build bridges between prior knowledge and current learning, and those kinds of lives that are existing in and outside of what they're doing inside their programs. So the ePortfolio itself is troublesome knowledge. Within that, and I can't untangle reflection from that, is that firstly, a portfolio is a difficult concept to grasp. To actually go into an invisible but visible space, to understand and have the digital literacies to not only function but practice within that space is difficult. And the concepts within that, if they haven't been developed in terms of reflexive and reflective practice, can seem really difficult to actually consider as a part of your own practice when you're a student, and there's so many other things that are going on in your life. So one of the ways that I do it with my students is to develop, firstly, just the habit of mind to collect. And within that collection, I'm forcing a reflexive collection, which is what is most important to what I'm actually learning at the time, and what is an artifact and what is an evidence, what is evidence of that. And sometimes they're similar, sometimes they're very different, sometimes they have nothing to do with the program. But as people becoming teachers in a master's program, where I am right now, who already have an undergraduate credential in visual art and design, who already have life experience as artists, what are the things that I'm now relating to my new knowledge acquisition, to what I already know? And how do I start to collect artifacts and evidence of that? And that has forced them into the habit of just being able to think about a portfolio firstly as a repository, where I can collect the things that I'm actually working on right now, to then create very pivotal points where I intervene and now ask for that collection to be refined. And I start to talk about those moments of reflective practice through curation. So they're practice-based research sites for me, and it's what I spent my time in my PhD developing. Practice-based research is probably more known in the arts and in the creative arts. And for me, it's where portfolios come from. We have always, as artists, if you know any artists or designers, we use portfolios as a part of our continual practice. And that practice means that we're developing new creative sites each time as practitioners that we need to show our work to people or be reflective of the kinds of work that we're developing. And so that's a sustained practice where we go back to develop new ideas based on other processes and products that we've worked through in the past. And so generally, I guess, in the dissertation or thesis world, a practice-based research has meant that you are developing a new concept, a new piece of practice for the field. And I really see that portfolios can't be pulled out of that space. We need to think about them as sites of research, particularly in a master's program where I teach right now, where at AQF 8 and 9, we're really focused on what it means to be a researcher, what becoming researcher means, and that the side of the portfolio actually enables us to think about developing a new creative product, but also thinking about how we can be developing research through a focus on looking at ourselves as researchers. So digital literacies, again, can't be pulled away from that. How do we think about what data is in relationship to being a researcher, and what is the evidence of learning in relationship to that data? Can I look at actual pieces of assessment as data? And in re-looking at that data, how do I now make, and this is probably a bit too qual for some quant researchers here, but how do I now start to develop new stories about myself as a learner in relationship to that data that I'm collecting in those repositories? So for me, I define a portfolio as a curated site of exhibition. I'm very located in my language of artistry, but what creativity really asks us to think about in terms of a digital cabinet of wonder or a Wunderkammer. How do I curate and create a space that somebody wants to enter into to develop an understanding of me, to see my being, to see my doing, to see my making through my own systemized collection, through my own self-reflection. So in doing that, I use curation. Now, curation has been a bit hijacked by the digital edtech world, because sometimes we assume that automation is curation, but it's not. Curation is purposeful. And it's in that purposeful action and reaction and interactions that I make when I'm looking at what I know how to do. And I'm now making new connections between other artifacts and other pieces of evidence. It's what I did for my thesis. I had to write my thesis in a number of spaces first to actually develop that practice, that reflective practice of refining, of rewriting. Every time I put one piece of artifact next to another piece of evidence, the first artifact shifts meaning. So I refer to portfolios as identity artifacts, and I think, pulling off where I start with Dave Bowd's propositions, they're one of the things I want to talk about assessment as. What are the identity artifacts of programs when we're in higher education? Now, this is very different to secondary or in vocational education, but I think that we can start to use the language and think about what evidence of learning is for the actual learner and not for the teacher. ePortfolios and digital portfolios are learning-centered tools. They're learning-centered pedagogies, and too often we get wrapped up in what we want out of them, rather than the student thinking about their learning object. What is their learning object, and what does that learning object mean to them? And developing that so what idea right from the start. So the field has got together over the last 2 years. I've just published, and it's just been launched formally today. You can go in and have a look at the field guide to portfolios. What does the field say about this? The field actually mentions reflection 122 times in this text. Short, concise papers, and you'll see when you go in there that reflection is the most important part, or to me the threshold concept, but the most important part of what a portfolio pedagogy can and should be, and how we actually ask our students and invite our students into being reflective practitioners takes time, because it is bound knowledge and it is bound to the discipline the language and terms change every time we talk about those words as well. And so we need to be careful around the kinds of words that we use and careful around the ways that we scaffold and model students into that type of practice, and think ethically about how we use the space and the site of reflection and how we extend students into often difficult places in reflection. Reflecting on something you don't know is really hard to tell somebody, particularly in a course or program where you feel like you should already know the answer, or you're a product of good standardized education, and not knowing the answer is wrong. So how do we start to unlearn some of those things through reflection to develop new concepts of ourselves? That's me.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate. I think you've taken us to a really conceptual kind of deep kind of space there. Do we have any questions from the crowd? I don't think we captured any in the chat. Lots of pauses coming in. Well, I suppose I have a question then for you, Kate. I think how you started was really interesting, talking about the flow, and it's kind of an interesting space to talk about it, because flow kind of in a psychology is kind of seen as a space where people are just immersed into doing something and forget about everything else that's happening around them. And if you were to take that approach to ePortfolio, where learners can be in that space in creating something, how do we scaffold that to happen? And is that possible? And is there approach to doing that?
I think so that the portfolio pedagogy actually enables that, because one of the things between collection and selection and then curation before publication are the liminal spaces between those concepts. So in the habit of mind of being reflexive to collect, it actually takes time, not to write an about me page, because that's just a product, it's not process driven, but to actually think about the space between collecting and then selecting actually requires flow. Now, one of the things we see, even included in the response before about 3 different students, the thing that we don't often talk to students about are those liminal spaces, the times when that reflection enabled them to go to another space, another place really, rather than space, to think through what it is that they know and how they know it. And then to use, for me, research practice to teach the methodology of portfolio, not as a pedagogy, but as a research methodology, to teach through either narrative or critical autoethnography, or using qualitative research methods to get to find yourself in that moment of flow. Now, researchers know those moments of flow very well, but we don't teach that to students very often. We somehow assume that someone's taught them how to do reflective practice somewhere. It's not a bunch of questions, and it's not a model. It is to me about flow, and it is creative practice. It's a form of creativity to work as a reflective practitioner. And so for those of us who know how to do it, and not everyone knows flow, but for those of us who do, I think we actually need to spend time with students, inviting them into that practice, because to me, flow and reflective practice are intertwined. It's not about writing something down or a response to something. That's still being reflexive. It's the moments between. So how do we allow students into those liminal spaces and allow them to understand that learning in that liminal space is constructive? It's really sophisticated, deep critical thinking, and that asks students to take time. We also need to develop time in between our assessments, time between the reflection we provide. We need to design, like Dave says, authentic tasks, sustainable tasks, where one task leads to another task leads to another task. We need to design program-wide assessment, where one task in one semester leads to another task in another semester. Ask them to be reflective. And what is the evidence of that reflection can only be found, for me, in moments of flow.
Very good, Kate. The time is ticking, so we might go to the next very quick question from Tom. Sorry, Kate Mitchell. We might keep those questions for later. Tom is asking, have you had any issues with confidentiality with people collecting learning tools?
In different programs that I've worked in as a consultant, we've had them. And these are discipline specific. And this is why I want portfolios to be located in terms of research methodologies. Each of our research spaces and disciplines have very specific ethical responsibilities. We need to teach the ethics of research to students in our disciplines. And I think that if we do that, then we won't have those problems, because in teacher education, I have very specific ethical responsibilities. In science education, in medical science, each of us have those. And that's a part of digital literacies to me. It's why they're literacies. What are the civic and cultural understandings or literacies in working in digital spaces? So, and it still just comes back to research. You know, if we teach students to be researchers, ethical researchers, then I don't think we'll have those issues. And I don't have them when I teach those methods.
Thanks, Kate. I know Trina asked a really good question around flow as well, but time is up, so I might wrap it here and ask Trina and Kate Mitchell to connect with you, Kate, later on.
Yeah, please.
Thanks very much, Kate. And if everybody can join me thanking Kate, we might just wrap this up here. Thank you to all of the 3 terrific presenters today, and to everyone contributing to the discussion. Colin, Kate and I will be at the Ascalite in Toowoomba next month. So we have a TELedvisors meetup there. So we hope to see some of you there if you're also coming. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Sorry, just a quick one. Just a reminder, because there's quite a few in the chat today. So if you're new, you can find out a bit more about our group through the Ascalite website, and then we also have a Moodle site that you're welcome to join. Let me just see if I can get the link. Here we go. It's TELedvisors. Let me just grab it. I just put it in there. Oh yeah.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Kate, for the reminder.
So feel free to join up there if you're interested in knowing what we're up to and just keeping the conversation going, because I think today's been a great example of you know, some terrific discussions happening, and it'd be great to continue discussing some of these deeper kind of questions, which we don't always get time for. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.